Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with the Mishna Yomi Masechet Eruvin. We're up to Perek Dal Mishnah Bet. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'elu Nishmat Neria ben Tzvetlana Ranbai ben Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. Yesterday's Mishnah recorded an incident in which Rabban Gamliel and his colleagues were on a ship that went beyond the Tchum on Shabbat. Today's Mishnah records another Tchum-related incident that occurred to these Tanaim while they were traveling. Once, on another occasion, the ship on which they were traveling did not enter the port on Friday until it became dark and Shabbat had begun. Now, concerned that the port city was beyond their Tchum that was established at sea when Shabbat began, Amrulo le Rabban Gamliel, the sages who wished to spend Shabbat in the port city, said to Rabban Gamliel, Ma anu lered, may we disembark and enter the city or not? Now, the commentaries explain, a traveler who intends to spend Shabbat in a certain city is considered a resident of that city as long as he is within 2,000 amot of that city when Shabbat begins, as we will learn in Mishnah 4 Bezrat Hashem Bli Neder. Now, the intention of these travelers was to spend Shabbat in the port city. Therefore, if the ship was within 2,000 amot of the city when Shabbat began, they would be considered residents of the city and allowed to disembark and enter the city. But if the ship was more than 2,000 amot away when Shabbat began, they would be forbidden to enter the city, since it would be beyond the Tchum they acquired at sea when Shabbat began. So they asked Rabban Gamliel, Amar len mutaratem, he said to them, you are permitted to disembark and enter the city. For I was already gazing at the port before Shabbat began, and I observed that we were within the Tchum of the city before it became dark. Now the Gemara on page 43b in Masechet Eruvin explains that Rabban Gamliel had a viewing tube without lenses, because that was not invented yet, which he had set to measure a distance of 2,000 amot. So he had a regular viewing tube that he set to measure a distance of 2,000 amot. Now a long, narrow tube limits the viewer's range. So Rabban Gamliel measured a 2,000 amot distance on land and then set the length of the tube so that he could not see through it beyond the 2,000 amot. He had this tube with him on the ship, and as night was falling, he looked through it towards the port. Since he was able to see the port city, he knew that the ship was within 2,000 amot of the city. Now Rabban Gamliel told them, since we were within the Tchum of the city when Shabbat began, the city is considered our Shabbat residence, and we may walk throughout the city in 2,000 amot beyond it in every direction. That is the Rabotai of Mishnah Bet. Mishnah Gimel now continues. We learned in the first Mishnah of this chapter that one who leaves his Tchum must remain in his place for the entire day. Now, a Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, chapter 2, Mishnah 5, lists several exceptions to this rule. Witnesses who go outside the Tchum to testify about the new moon, a midwife who goes to deliver a baby, or people going to rescue others from a fire, an attacking army, a flood, or a collapsed building. Now, it is permitted to violate the laws of Shabbat for the sake of testifying about the new moon, as the Mishnayot in Masechet Rosh Hashanah say, chapter 1, Mishnayot 4 through 6, and Mishnah 9. And similarly, a midwife and rescuer are allowed and even obligated to desecrate the Shabbat laws in order to save a life. Now, in all these cases that we mentioned, they are all given a new 2,000 amat tchum at their new location. Strictly speaking, Tosafot explained on page 23b that these people should have to remain in place at the new location for the entire day. However, the rabbis granted them a new tchum in order that they not be discouraged from going on these mitzvot and life-saving errands. Now, the following Mishnah deals with a person who left his tchum on such a mission, but before he reached his destination, he discovered that his services were no longer needed. Mishiyatza bilshut. If one left his tchum with legal permission, so for example, in order to testify about the new moon or to save a life, and before he reached his destination, people told him the deed that you set out to do has already been done, and there is no need for you to continue traveling. Now, meaning Rosh Chodesh was already declared, the danger had passed. He has a new tchum of 2,000 amot in every direction, measured from the place where he was notified that his services were not required. Furthermore, if his new tchum entered into the original tchum he had when Shabbat began, it is as if he had never left his original tchum, and he may return to his house. Now, the commentators give an example. Let's say he walked 3,500 amot from his home before discovering that his services were no longer needed. Since he now has a new tchum, he can walk back 2,000 amot in the direction from which he came, and this takes him 500 amot into his old tchum. Now, the new tchum to which he is now entitled enables him to return to his original tchum within the overlapping area. Since he still has access to his original tchum, we consider it as if he never traveled beyond it, and therefore he is allowed to return home and resume the use of his original tchum. Once he returns to a point within his original tchum, he regains it and is no longer allowed to walk beyond that tchum, as the Mishnah Berurah writes in chapter 407 of Orach Chaim, Sif Katan 7. The Mishnah continues, the rabbis granted this leniency just as they granted a leniency for all those who go out on Shabbat to save other Jews from attack. They may return to their places with their weapons, which is an act normally forbidden under the melacha of transferring. And the commentaries explain that when we say, just as they granted a leniency for all those who go out on Shabbat to save the Jews from attack, that they may return to their places. The Mishnah is speaking of a case in which the battle took place within their tchum, or where their new tchum overlapped their original tchum, and the rabbis gave them permission to go back. Otherwise, they may walk 2,000 amot in every direction, but not back to their homes. But the rabbis gave them this leniency that they may even return back. Now, like we said, with their weapons, which is an act normally forbidden under the melacha of transferring, as the Rav explains. Now, if returning troops would be required to leave their weapons behind, the commentary said they would be defenseless against a possible counterattack staged by the retreating enemies should they realize that the Jewish troops no longer have their weapons. So because of this concern, the rabbis allowed them to take their weapons with them back home. And that is an Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.